Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's workshop, The Truth About Liver Cancer. Today's topic is compassionate use in cancer. The Truth About Liver Cancer is produced by Blue Faery, the Adrian Wilson Liver Cancer Association, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting patients, caregivers, and families impacted by liver cancer, specifically hepatocellular carcinoma, also known as HCC. Blue Fairy's mission is to prevent, treat, and cure primary liver cancer through research, education, and advocacy. I'm your host, Aura Sanchez, and I'm the program manager at Blue Fairy. I'm incredibly passionate about health, education, and advocacy, and helping people access meaningful resources and support. Working for this incredible organization has given me the opportunity to connect with patients, caregivers, families, as well as healthcare professionals and advocates. I've seen firsthand the impact that education and community and hope can have during difficult journeys. And it has reinforced for me how important it is that people feel supported, empowered, and informed throughout their healthcare journey. I'm very excited about today's topic. Today's workshop focuses on compassionate use, also known as expanded access, which allows patients with serious or life-threatening conditions to access investigational treatments outside of clinical trials, where no comparable treatment options are available. Through today's conversation, we hope to create a space of learning and sharing experiences, and also create a better understanding of the role compassionate use can play in offering hope and expanding treatment possibilities. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our incredible panelists that will be joining us today. We have a wonderful group of panelists who will be sharing real life experiences as well as perspectives related to compassionate use. Joining us today is Andrea Wilson-Woods, Dr. Richard Finn, Will Monlux, and Dr. Ildiko Csiki. And we are so grateful that they're taking the time out on their Saturday to be here with us today to share their knowledge, experiences, and insights. Now, before we jump into today's discussion, let me tell you a little bit about the platform that we're using today, Zoom webinars. Zoom webinars works a little bit different than Zoom meetings. So we want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable using the platform and that they know where to find the tools available during today's session. So first, let's talk about the Zoom toolbar. So Zoom likes to hide it sometimes, so it might be a little complicated, but nothing too complex. So if you don't immediately see the Zoom toolbar, you can simply just glide your mouse over the screen, or if you're on a tablet, just tap the screen and you'll be able to see the Zoom toolbar appear at the bottom of your screen. That toolbar is where you're going to find most of the features that we're going to be using throughout the webinar today. Now let's talk about the chat feature. So once you glide the mouse over, you should be able to see the chat feature at the very bottom. And chat works a little different in Zoom meetings than it does on webinars. So when you send a message in the chat, you'll be chatting with myself and our panelists, but not necessarily with any of the other attendees. And that's perfectly okay. If at any point you experience any technical difficulties or need assistance, the chat is a good place to let me know that you're having trouble, as well as Andrea, who's also helping us out in the chat. So if you have any issues, I'll be keeping an eye out there. So now let's test it out. If you guys could just send us a thumbs up in the chat, tell us where you're joining us from today, or you could even surprise me and tell me what your favorite dessert is, just so that I know the chat feature is working properly. Hello from Jane, Abigail. Thanks, Andrea. Andrea likes vanilla bean ice cream. Awesome. Cool. Now that I see that a couple of you have sent messages and that the chat is working just fine, I want to test out the reactions of the Zoom webinar. So like I said before, just glide your mouse over. There should be a react button at the very bottom. It's typically, maybe if you see a heart, that should be the reaction button. And there should be emojis there like clapping, thumbs up, the party emoji, or hearts. So we'd love to make this webinar super interactive. So it's important that we see the reactions throughout. It's also a way for our panelists to know that the the things that they're sharing, they're really making an impact. So feel free to send as many reactions as you'd like throughout the webinar. Awesome. I see that many of you have found it. So now let's talk about one of the biggest difference between Zoom webinars and Zoom meetings. Zoom webinars has a Q&A feature. So you'll notice that the Q&A is separate from the chat. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar pertaining to our panelists, you can go ahead and pop them in the Q&A session, the Q&A section. It's different than chat, like I mentioned. Chat you'll be using if you're having trouble throughout the webinar. So for the Q&A section, just go ahead and type your question and then click send. We want your questions, so please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar as they come to mind, and we'll collect them along the webinar and answer them at the top of the hour during our Q&A discussion. You'll also be able to see other attendees' questions and upvote them. That helps us directly identify the most popular questions so we can answer those first. We may not be able to get to all of them if we have an overwhelming amount, but we're going to do our very best to answer all of them. So now that everybody is a little bit of a Zoom expert, I think that we're ready to get started. I'd like to introduce you guys to our very first panelist, which I'm very grateful for, Andrea Wilson Woods. Andrea Wilson Woods is the founder of Blue Faery, the Adrian Wilson Liver Cancer Association, and a dedicated patient advocate. Inspired by her sister's journey, and Andrea has built a national platform focused on awareness, education, and support. With a background in storytelling and nonprofit leadership, Andrea works to ensure that no one faces liver cancer alone and that every voice is heard. Andrea, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Aura. This is great that you're the host instead of me.
It's a little different now. Thanks so much for everything. So, Andrea, for those that may not know Adrian's story and have never heard about Blue Fairy, can you introduce us to her and what happened when she was diagnosed?
Yes, so Adrian was my half sister. We have the same mother and different fathers. And I raised Adrian the last 7 years of her life. So when I was 22, living in Los Angeles, Adrian was 8, and she came to visit me for what was supposed to be a 2-week Christmas vacation. And then our mother asked me to take full custody of her. So I gained legal and physical custody. And despite our 14-year age gap, we were very, very close. And I consider her both my child and my sister. And in fact, at the time of this recording, for those of you who may be watching this later, today is the 25th anniversary of the day that changed our lives forever. So on May 16th, 2001, she was finishing her first year of high school, and she was suddenly diagnosed with hepatocellular carcinoma, or HCC. And I came home from work and found her on the living room floor, curled up in a fetal position, crying and saying that she couldn't breathe. And we went to her pediatrician. Her pediatrician sent us to the local hospital in Burbank, California. And it was actually a CAT scan that showed that she had tumors in her liver and lungs. And then that same hospital, they did not treat pediatric patients. So we were rushed by ambulance to Children's Hospital Los Angeles that night. And that all happened in the span of less than 6 hours. And that was
Wow.
day one. Like I said, that was 25 years ago today. And so from the diagnosis to her passing, Adrienne lived 147 days.
Wow. Wow. And every time I hear the story, it's so impactful. So tell me a little bit about, so when she was diagnosed, what treatment options were available at the time?
Well, and again, this was May of 2001. So there were no specific treatment options for liver cancer, especially stage 4, metastasized. And she was put on a very aggressive chemotherapy regimen. But I didn't know that those therapies actually weren't meant for liver cancer, and nothing existed yet. And we didn't know she was essentially getting palliative care. Those words were never used. And we weren't told that there was no evidence that this chemotherapy would extend her life. And, over time, the side effects became incredibly toxic and devastating. And every round of chemotherapy was more difficult than the previous one. And she spent a lot of time in the hospital due to complications. So it was a rough ride.
And for those of you, and for those people that are listening in and might not know what palliative care is, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so palliative care, we have a great previous workshop about this. It's people confuse it with hospice. It's not hospice. You can get palliative care at any time, but the goal of palliative care is to support your treatment, um, and and it's not curative. And so and it's not just chemotherapy, it can be other ways to support your treatment, whether that's physical therapy or mental health support. So you can have palliative care throughout your whole cancer journey, and hopefully you do, but it's not hospice, which is quite a different topic.
Thanks for that. And so, at what point, I mean, Adrian was getting all these different types of treatments. At what point did you guys start looking beyond the treatments that they were offering?
Yeah, I became determined very early to find survivors of stage 4 liver cancer because, in my mind, even though I was new to all of this, to me it seemed statistically impossible that no one had ever survived. So I dove deep into PubMed and I was reading every study I could come across. And she was diagnosed in May. It wasn't until August that I came across some reports of a study done in Japan involving patients with metastatic liver cancer, exactly like Adrian. So they had metastases to their lungs, some of them even to their bones. And there were survivors, a handful of like 4 to 5 survivors that got this very specific drug combination, but it included an investigational therapy. And that discovery completely changed my whole mindset because it made me realize that there was more out there besides the standard chemotherapy, even if those other options were really difficult to access.
Wow. And was that kind of what we now call your first introduction to what we now call compassionate use slash expanded access, learning about those
Yeah, I mean, that was
investigational
the
drugs?
beginning. That was the beginning of it. I didn't know that term yet. I was just obsessed to figure out a way to get Adrian access to these investigational treatments, especially this one where there had been some survivors. So I started reaching out to doctors, pharmaceutical companies, researchers. I mean, anyone I thought could help us. I had this huge chemotherapy reference book, and in it, it would tell you which drugs were approved and which were investigational. Yeah, and looking back now, that was probably my first exposure to it, even though that term wasn't used.
And were any of Adrian's doctors, was this anything that they suggested at all, or they didn't have enough information about it either?
Uh, that came later. That came later. There was a doctor that suggested it later. So we eventually got a second opinion at UCLA because the trouble was at Children's Hospital, Adrian's doctors did not see her cancer very often. And in fact, her very first oncologist had only ever had 6 patients with HCC. And so here she was, she had a very quote adult cancer, but she was in a children's hospital. So we got her transferred to UCLA with to see Dr. Rafael Amato, who saw her cancer every single day. And we liked him immediately. He was very direct and honest. And one of the things he did bring up early was the possibility of clinical trials and exploring additional options. And that was so refreshing because, and again, this was 25 years ago and things have changed, but I brought up clinical trials early on at Children's Hospital, and they said absolutely not because Adrian wasn't 18 years old yet. And which was crazy because she was taller than me and she was a grown young woman. And but at the time, and again, that has improved. But at the time, it was nearly impossible to get someone who wasn't of legal age into a clinical trial.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, I'm so curious, what was Adrian's perspective throughout all this?
On which part?
Well, well, I mean, when it came to her diagnosis and then hearing the options she had right after that.
Um, well, when she found out one of the initial chemotherapy drugs was going to cause permanent hearing loss, and it wasn't a maybe, it was a definite, it will cause permanent hearing loss. Um, she said, I'd rather be dead than deaf because she was a budding musician and she was furious. And so I made an agreement with her that if she experienced any hearing loss, that we would take her off that chemotherapy, which was cisplatin. And we did because she did start to experience hearing loss. So she was very active and very engaged. And in fact, when she experienced that hearing loss, she said to the doctor, "My sister has a chemotherapy book with over 200 different drugs. Pick a different one. I don't like that one." And so we did. But we got to UCLA, um, and that was exciting because she was offered a clinical trial, and it was a phase two. And again, if people don't know what this stuff means, we have a great workshop on our YouTube about clinical trials, but it was a phase two dendritic, dendritic, Dr. Finn can correct my pronunciation, cell therapy trial. And we looked at the information carefully. And initially I was excited because it was like, oh, wow, finally they're going to let her in a clinical trial, even though she's 15. But the problem was there was no evidence at the time that it was helping liver cancer patients. And the schedule or the design of the clinical trial was that she would have to be at UCLA Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And
Wow.
Adrian said, absolutely not. And again, she advocated for herself and said, I'm not going to spend what time I have left in the hospital. I want to go back to school. And she did go back to school, outpatient, but she did go back to school. And so we turned down that clinical trial.
And so when she turned down that clinical trial and you guys were going through treatment, how did compassionate use eventually become a part of her story?
So toward the end of her life, well, my best friend from college, her mother worked at NIH as a scientist and researcher, actually in breast cancer, and so she was really helpful throughout. And through her, we learned about an investigational immunotherapy drug called thymosin alpha 1. It goes under the brand name Zadaxin, and it's used to treat hepatitis B and C. Now, Adrian's team, including Dr. Amato, didn't think it would help her, but they didn't think it would hurt her either. And so for me, it's Zadaxin became our last hope. Like that, I was clinging to it. And to Dr. Amato's credit and to the pharmaceutical company, they worked together. They pushed that paperwork through the FDA so fast so she could receive access to the drug outside of a clinical trial setting. So Dr. Amato was going to oversee the protocol, and I was going to administer the drug at home. And so she essentially got approved for a one-woman clinical trial. Um, but she died before she ever got a chance to try the drug. And so I later learned that all these things that were emotion, it was compassionate use. But when I say that, they worked together so fast to make this happen, they made it happen in, under 2 weeks, maybe even under a week. It was super, super fast. And the plan was the next time she was going to go in was to try Zadaxin.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely a quick turnaround. So now
Mhm.
looking back now, what do you wish more patients and caregivers understood about compassionate use?
Um, it's okay to ask questions and to keep searching for options. Like I said, no one told us Adrienne was getting palliative care. Those words weren't used. I didn't know she could access these drugs outside of a clinical trial until Dr. Amato told me. And so I think it's really important to connect with reputable patient advocacy organizations because they can help guide patients toward resources and clinical trials and even investigational treatments. And one person cannot manage all of this alone. And I had a really good support system. And so you need that. You need people helping you research and advocate for you. And you need doctors who are willing to explore every option, but also be very direct and honest with you. And I guess the last thing I'll say about it is, I kind of lost my train of thought, was at the end of the day, it's the patient's decision.
Right.
You know, I didn't want to take Adrian off that one chemotherapy drug, but we did. Um, I was borderline willing to give the clinical trial a chance, but she didn't want to spend 40 hours a week at UCLA, which I understood. And so I think as a caregiver, especially a parent, you really struggle and you have to understand it's it's your fight, but it's your loved one that's living with cancer. So at the end of the day, you need to defer to them.
100%. That's great advice. So thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing your experience and your expertise. We're going to have Andrea come right back at the top of the hour. So we're going to say goodbye for now, and then she'll be right back with us. And if you guys have any questions, make sure to pop them into the Q&A and we'll answer them towards the very end. Now I'd like to welcome our second panelist of the day, Dr. Richard Finn. Dr. Richard Finn is a professor of medicine in the Division of Hematology/Oncology at the David Geffen School of Medicine in UCLA, and a leading expert in liver cancer research and treatment. His work focuses on the development of targeted therapies, immunotherapies for hepatocellular carcinoma and other solid tumors. Dr. Finn has played a key role in advancing clinical trials and innovative treatments in liver cancer care. He completed his medical degree at the Keck School of Medicine of USC and returned to UCLA for his residency and fellowship training in hematology and oncology. Welcome, Dr. Finn. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, and he's very far away right now, all the way in India. So thanks so much again for joining us. So, Dr. Finn, before we dive right into compassionate use and expanded access, I always love to ask doctors this question at the very beginning. What made you decide to be a doctor and go into oncology?
Yeah, we chatted about this the other day.
Yeah,
Aura's husband is a pilot in the Air Force, and I initially had that goal as well. I was My dad had been an engineer. I grew up in Southern California, and aerospace was a big thing for many of the families in our neighborhood. Uh, and I was going to be an engineer, and then hopefully go into the Air Force and become a pilot. But then my mom got diagnosed with breast cancer. She had actually had it for many years, and uh, my parents kept that from us to protect us, but it did get advanced as I was graduating high school. And, that kind of changed my trajectory. I really was inspired by the doctors taking care of her. And, this is the late 80s. And, even in a disease like breast cancer, treatment was pretty much at that time chemotherapy, right?
all right.
And it was marginally effective. I mean, certainly for advanced disease, and to see how things have changed in the past 30 years is really remarkable. But that really changed my trajectory. She passed away during my first quarter of college. I was at UC San
Sorry.
Diego at the time, and then transferred to UCLA to be closer to home. And there, I started looking into a career in medicine, and I was very fortunate to walk in the lab of my mentor and still my boss at UCLA, Dennis Slayman, who, had made very pivotal contributions in the development of targeted therapies for breast cancer against HER2. He had discovered that alteration, and I was in his lab as an undergrad at the time that these antibodies were being tested. And, it was very clear to me this is what I wanted to do, be an
Right.
academic medical oncologist. And that really what I went to medical school to do that. People would say in medical school, what do you think you want to do? What kind of specialty? And right away, it was a medical oncologist, a little
You already knew.
atypical. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I've been very blessed in my career for sure.
Wow, well, that's amazing. You knew exactly what you wanted to do. And so for many people that are joining us here today, it might be their first time hearing compassionate use or expanded access. If you can, in simple terms, can you explain to them what that means?
Yeah, I think the words are used synonymously now.
Mhm.
And it's really a way uh, through through the FDA, really. So it's regulated, a way for patients who have serious life-threatening conditions to get new drugs or devices outside of clinical trials. Just as you heard from Andrea talking about her sister, and with Dr. Amato's efforts to get her a drug outside of a clinical trial. Patients don't always qualify for clinical trials. Clinical trials are experiments, right? And they're designed to answer a very specific question. And therefore, they need to be well designed and select patients who are typically fit, uh, medically fit. Their labs are usually, fitting criteria. They can't be on certain other medications for chronic illnesses. There's a long list of what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria that allow us to put a patient on a clinical trial, and patients don't always check all those boxes. So there's been a mechanism for some time uh, to allow patients access to these drugs if they don't qualify for a clinical trial.
Well, I'm sure that everybody was able to, thank you for simplifying it and getting our viewers to truly understand. So now, when it comes to compassionate use, when is that typically considered for a patient? I know it's not, you can't simply wake up one day and say, I want to try compassionate use.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually for patients who don't have other good options, right? You know, in the context of liver cancer, today, unlike when Adrian was sick. Now we do have a lot of drugs that have been proven to be effective and active. Uh, but at the same time, at some point, what we have might not be working. And seeing your doctor and working with them, and some patients are in very good shape, but there's just no good options for them. And that might be the time that someone would pursue something through an expanded access program. That's one example.
Right. And what can be, I guess, some of the biggest barriers that can make compassionate use difficult to answer if a patient believes that they can qualify for it?
Yeah, so it's not as easy as just writing a prescription and taking it to CVS to get the drug.
Yeah,
By definition, these drugs are not readily available, right? And so it is a regulated process and takes some paperwork, right? And typically, there's a few steps. One is essentially writing a protocol. You need to submit to the FDA a proposal, right? I am going to treat one patient who has this diagnosis and limited options, some history about the patient with this agent, which has to be in clinical trials. It can't be something, in the lab. It has to be at least in a clinical trial. It doesn't need to be approved, but, going through clinical development, and say that, we're going to monitor, oh, well, we're going to give them treatment every 3 days or whatever, some protocol as far as how frequently they'll be taking it, whether it's oral or an infusion, how frequently they'll be seen in the office, how frequently you'll check labs, how frequently you'll do imaging, and what are your quote unquote criteria for continuing treatment or stopping treatment. Uh, the other thing is you need to get buy-in from the manufacturer, right? That they, some drugs that are very promising and are fairly advanced in their clinical development, companies start an expanded access program. Uh, Sometimes when they're expecting regulatory approval, expanded access can be in different flavors, right? So
right,
sometimes a company will make a drug available at sites that already had been evaluating it, right? A
right,
clinical trial is ongoing, or it just finished and it looks very exciting and they're expecting approval, but it's not yet approved. So sites can open an expanded access program for that drug. That's the easier way to do it. The harder way to do it is when a drug is not in an expanded access program. And what I was saying is you create your own, right? You write a protocol
right,
for your patient, you submit that to the FDA, you have to get the manufacturer to agree to provide the drug. And typically you need to get, a institutional review board or an IRB to approve it. And their process is looking to make sure this is ethical, that, you know, uh, you're doing things in a scientific way with some oversight, right? They want some oversight, local oversight. And so all that takes time and effort, right? And you know, it can be very challenging for someone in a community setting to do that, all this paperwork, a little
Right.
bit of
Yeah.
bureaucratic process, uh, because they're
And
busy seeing patients and such.
right. And so it can, like you said, it could be an overwhelming process for patients, caregivers, families. And so for the ones that are listening in today that maybe feel overwhelmed with, hey, what are my options? I feel like this, I can maybe qualify for this. Where do you suggest that they begin if they are being seen in a community setting?
Yeah, and I think the internet can be a lot of confusion, in some ways. Uh, the there's just so much information out there. And so certainly with liver cancer, you know, Andrea had mentioned like initially Adrian saw a doctor who maybe saw 4 cases a year, right? Now, in large academic centers, there's people like myself and my colleagues who are focused on hepatobiliary malignancies. I see probably 50 HCCs a week, right? Which is a
Oh,
very high volume because I'm at UCLA where we have a very large liver transplant center that supports all these liver cancer patients. Uh, and so, in centers like that, we know what's approved and options in that context, but also maybe what's promising in the future or is showing early clinical efficacy that might be worth pursuing in a compassionate use program. So I do think for people in the community with liver cancer, it really makes a lot of sense to at least see someone at a large tertiary center at least once in their course, preferably at the beginning or even later on in their course if they feel like they're not getting good answers from their treating physician.
yeah, definitely encouraging a second opinion for sure. It doesn't hurt to get a second opinion. And so how do you hope expanded access? I mean, I know we've made so many advancements from what Andrea was telling us from her first experience with compassionate use to now. How do you hope that expanded access eventually evolves a bit more in the future?
Yeah, and just while I get to that, Andrea put it in the chat, this whole process of going to the FDA and the manufacturer, that process is called a single patient IND, right? And uh, in the future, how can we make this less bureaucratic, right? And a few years ago, a Congress passed the Right to Try Act, right? And this is a little different because this is really just between the patient and the medical team and the manufacturer, right? This kind of takes the FDA out of the equation. So it decreases the bureaucratic process, the paperwork, but at the same time, companies aren't required to make a drug available. This process does not need an IND. It's more of the doctor, the patient talking directly to industry to make it a little easier for patients with life-threatening conditions to get access to these new drugs. Now, uh, you know, in the context of expanded access as it exists today, I think really it's a matter of minimizing the amount of paperwork. And
Right.
what drives the paperwork, I think, is a legal framework that we live in, where industry is worried about liability. Doctors are worried about liability. The FDA is worried about liability. And if there's some way to protect everybody involved from, you know, when I say liability, it's really, being sued by somebody or a
Right.
company, a company that's developing a drug, gives it out through expanded access, and someone has, some unexpected side effect that can really damage the future development of that drug, right?
Right.
Even though the drug might not have been the cause of the adverse event, someone dies, God forbid, from something in an expanded access program, that can really hurt the industry partner. So the industry partner would want some protection in the future for being a good Samaritan, so to speak, and letting the drug be accessible. And also for the physicians, again, to put this single IND forward, at least in academia, I have a research team that can help me, right? Who are already doing these things in the context of clinical trials that we're putting through. And again, it's outside of, what they usually do, but they have the skill set. And in the community, it would be virtually impossible, I think, for a community physician, a busy oncologist to go through this process on their own. It takes a lot of effort. Uh,
Yeah.
and at the same time, I mean, and I know Dr. Amato very well. We had some overlap at UCLA, and obviously he took sincere interest in Adrian's case, right? And went through the effort to put that in. Someone can't just show up at the doctor and say, "Oh, I need you to do this expanded access for me." That's just not, I think a reasonable expectation because it does even for us in academia, it takes
Yeah.
resources.
It's a lot of work that goes into it, and it's a process. So, I mean, thank you, Dr. Finn, for sharing all that expertise with us. And we're gonna have you come right back at the top of the hour for our Q&A session. So stay put. Now we're gonna bring on our next panelist. We're going to bring on Will Monlux. Hi, Will. Thanks for joining us. Will Monlux is a patient advocate, peer support leader, and a board member of Wonderlink. Early in his life, Will became deeply involved in intentional peer support work, eventually helping train others in IPS principles centered around connection, agency, and community. At age 29, he was diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer and later referred to hospice care. Through compassionate use, his treatment journey took a dramatic turn, and just 1 year later, he crossed the finish line of a triathlon. Today, Will continues advocating for patients through Wonderlink and Wonder Voices, helping create connection and hope for others navigating serious illnesses. Thank you, Will, for joining us here today. We're so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So, well, for those who are here today and watching this, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what your life looked like before your diagnosis?
Yeah, so I was diagnosed with cancer at 29 when I'd been in the process of applying for medical school. Um, and kind of at that time in my life, I'd kind of been like in a state of being frozen. But then like the cancer diagnosis came and I like to describe cancer as like the kind of that tiger that jumps out of like the bush. And like at first that was like really terrifying. But I think eventually like because I'd kind of been in that state of being frozen, it helped me move forward.
Right, right. And so when you were, I know it was must have been so shocking at first. I mean, you were only just 29. What were the symptoms that you first had and noticed it
So they
that
weren't,
were out of the ordinary?
yeah, they weren't symptoms that screamed like cancer in my mind.
Mhm.
Like the main ones that I really noticed were like diarrhea and vomiting. I think like retrospectively, there was a lot of fatigue, but it was really easy just to brush it off as, you know, part of like what I was going through in life.
Yeah, yeah, that must have been scary. And so when you went to, for example, maybe were you having regular checkups?
So I actually I was seeing my primary care doctor, um, and ironically, I had gone in like a little bit before when I eventually got diagnosed, and it's really easy to miss like the cancer, and so I had like an abdominal they felt and they didn't find it. But eventually, so I was, sorry.
Wow. Yeah. And so, I mean, like I mentioned before, you're just 29 and your life is just essentially starting. What what was it like hearing that diagnosis at such a young age?
It was really a shock. Like you go in thinking worst case scenarios like appendicitis, and now suddenly the ER doctor is saying, like, I've never seen a cancer this large in the liver. And so like those first 3 days, I remember not really sleeping at all, just kind of processing, first of all, like what is liver cancer? And then like the literature is not great. And so like slowly you go from like not even thinking about like your mortality to being like, okay, if I have 20 years, what would be most important? And then 10 years, and then 5 years. And then eventually I worked myself down to three of like, if I only have like this time left, like the thing that's most important to me is like making a positive impact in the community. And so like I started focusing on that aspect. Um, and yeah, that was just, I think having that really helped.
Yeah. And so let's backtrack a little bit. I know a little bit about your family life, but when you first heard that diagnosis, was there anybody there with you to support you, or did you have any support?
Well, so not when I was diagnosed. I went into the ER, and I think it was like at 2 in the morning when they eventually brought me in because they were doing a bunch of tests to find, like, they didn't think I would have liver cancer. And so when it came in, I was kind of alone in that room. And like the cancer, the liver cancer journey, kind of the treatment protocol. Um, like at first they're like, okay, we're looking at transplant immediately, and then it's okay, we can do a resection, and then eventually it was like focusing on systemic treatments to reduce the mass. But like at that beginning part, it was like I thought immediately, like one thing you don't realize about cancer is like things don't happen like immediately. And so like that night when I was alone, I thought, oh, the next day I might have a transplant.
Yeah. And so, you received the diagnosis, you're here thinking a million other things. What treatment plan did you guys initially go down with?
So the initial plan was um, to focus on trying to reduce the tumor burden to get a resection. And so I started with systemic immunotherapy. And I eventually progressed through like two of the first line treatments, and then a third line. And then eventually I got into clinical trial and I also fell out of that. And that's when I was then recommended for hospice.
Wow. And so what was it like being in that clinical trial?
So the clinical trial system is like my introduction to clinical trials was, you have to do that washout period, and um, I mean, that's a scary time where like the cancer is growing unimpeded. And then when I got done with that washout, you go in and like I no longer qualified for the trial, like at that time with my numbers. And I really, there's this shift of getting into a clinical trial is, I mean, it's lower odds than getting into like an Ivy League school. It's like really difficult. And so like there's big excitement to get in. And then, I mean, I eventually got in, but yeah, that the process is, yeah, it's scary.
Yeah, of course. And eventually you said you mentioned you were in a clinical trial and then recommended for hospice. What happened during that clinical trial?
So eventually, when I first got on the clinical trial, I was kind of having bad side effects from the beginning. I was getting rashes, and they had to like reduce the dose. But they kind of kept me in because I was having a good response. Um, Eventually, we found out, you know, when you have large cancer, like sometimes the measurements can be a little bit hard. And we found out like maybe I didn't have that like response. And so I think like one of the most challenging things about, being in like a clinical trial is uh, it can really feel really hard to like advocate for yourself because, there's not really many other options out there. But also like when you're seeing things that, you're deteriorating rapidly, um, like you're looking for other options. And I mean, that's a really difficult process. And, I was very fortunate in that, I had my father who was a physician who like I was going through like literature and kind of limiting it down to show him. And then he reached out, and I was incredibly lucky to get connected with Dr. Chiki. Like her passion, one of her passions is like helping patients with that compassion use. And it just so happened, like one of the papers that we've been looking at, she was like one of the authors, and that treatment wasn't a fit, but it turns out like based off kind of my genetic work that there was another one, and that's one thing that I think is important. Like for it's important like for since the like you can't really be advocating for the treatment like when you're recommended for hospice. It really requires like starting from the beginning. And like for me, the standard of care wasn't necessarily genetic work at the beginning, but like we kind of found that and like advocated for that, and then uh, we got connected. Like I got connected with Dr. Chiki, and that whole process of getting compassion use is like very difficult.
Right.
And that was all
Can
going.
you, sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah.
you were just about to go into it. So for the patients or our attendees listening in today, can you explain just how difficult that process can be? I know that you were extremely lucky to have your
Yeah.
father who was a physician, but if you could just go a little bit more into, how difficult is that process as the patient?
Oh, it's incredibly difficult. Like when at first when you see like research and it's exciting, you're like, oh, this is a good fit, let me go for it. But then like there's a lot of logistical issues. Like one of the first things is like there's not much awareness at all about compassion use. Like very fortuitously, like I mean my the oncologist I had primary there didn't really know about like compassion use. And then uh the process of getting like finding a drug is really challenging, and then the process of actually receiving the drug like is challenging. Like every aspect there are kind of like barriers that are difficult.
Right. Yeah, everything seems to have its own barrier that comes with it. And when you were finally able to receive treatment through compassionate use, I know quite a few things changed. As I mentioned at the beginning of your bio, you ran a triathlon. Can you can you tell us a little bit more about that? What changed initially?
Well, I think like one of the biggest things for me for compassion use, and not necessarily like the what ended up happening was like really like remarkable, but the biggest kind of turning point in the whole journey was actually when I was recommended like for hospice, because that is when I kind of got out of like that's when we really started pushing towards like the compassion use, and um having someone fighting for you and having that sense of agency, like even if it's not hope of I wasn't hoping that I would be running a triathlon, but like having that hope of like the next day is valuable, or like the fight is like important, makes a big difference. And then my life really changed. I got access to compassion use, and like within 6 weeks of having something that targeted my cancer, the volume went down dramatically.
Yeah. I mean, you ran a triathlon. I still can't wrap my brain. I can't even run a marathon. So, so let's start there. So, I mean, looking back now, what gives you hope today for better access to compassionate use for other patients?
I think my biggest passion is like raising awareness for like compassion use. It's something that like it really requires like stakeholders from all different like areas to come together to like look at what a solution would be. And like my hope is, that others don't like it's really the when you get into the cancer can often feel like you're floundering around like in the dark. But uh helping like make it so like that it helping other patients in that situation is kind of what I'm passionate about and gives me hope.
Awesome. Thank you, Will, for sharing, I mean, your experience with us, your story. We're gonna have you come right back at the top of the hour. We're gonna welcome our last panelist, Dr. Chiki. Um, Dr. Ildiko Csiki is an oncologist and cancer researcher with more than 20 years of experience in oncology, immunotherapy, and cancer drug development. She has held leadership roles across academic medicine and biotechnology industry, including positions of City of Hope, Merck, Inovio Pharmaceuticals, and Sensei Biotherapeutics. Dr. Chiki earned both her MD and PhD in cancer biology from Vanderbilt School of Medicine, and her work has focused on advancing innovative cancer therapies and expanding treatment options for patients through clinical trials and research and immunotherapy development. Dr. Chiki, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ara. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, so we're so excited to have you here. And like I mentioned to Dr. Finn, I love asking doctors this first question. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what got you into this field?
Yes, absolutely. Oncology has always been very deeply personal to me. So I lost several family members to cancer, including my grandfather. So I'm Hungarian by background, and I grew up with my grandfather. My grandma passed away at a young age, also from cancer, and it was basically me and my grandpa, who was a World War II veteran. He was a prisoner in Siberia for a very long time, managed to escape, come back, rebuild life a number of times, and was the hardest working person I ever known. And so I think ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to take care of people. I just even with animals, we had a farm, and my mom always tells me that I was trying to take care of the chicken and do whatever I could to help the animals. And so it was a natural for me to want to go into medicine. So I actually moved to the United States for college. I came as a student and wanted to do both research and ultimately go to medical school. But during that time, towards the end of my college experience, just as I was starting the MD PhD program, I had found out that my grandpa was diagnosed with advanced cancer. So I returned back home and tried to see if there were any treatments for him possible. And we tried to do some surgery just to find out. He had metastatic colorectal cancer.
Oh,
I had no choices, but I didn't want to let him suffer there alone. So I brought him with me to United States back. And however, at that point, I was a first-year math student, and there really were no options for him. The only thing I could do is just to make sure that he was in hospice and he could have, compassionate care for all of his symptoms. And he passed away, a month or so after coming to United States. And so that fueled even more my passion that cancer patients should have, the opportunity to fight. They should be able to fight back. And my grandpa never received any actual treatment for his cancer. And for this man that had the hardest life to have survived so much, to have been taken out by cancer, it was just very profoundly upsetting to me. So I dedicated, my life, my career to helping other cancer patients. I wrote my dissertation. I dedicated it to my grandpa, and then moved into oncology. I completed my internship, residency. I did a postdoc, and I joined. I took my first career faculty position at University of Pennsylvania, where in Philadelphia, where I saw actively patients. I focused on thoracic malignancies, and also set up a translational science laboratory that was NIH funded. And that work was very exciting, but that was at that time there really wasn't a lot of treatments for example, I focused on thoracic malignancies like lung cancer. We were just in the early days for immunotherapy. And so my focus was seeing patients and recommending them various clinical trials, while at the same time was doing really exciting work in the lab. And ultimately, of course, many patients do not qualify for clinical trials, or, their cancer progresses. And the hardest conversation I always had with my patients was this kind of end of road where there is nothing else left to offer. And just seeing that discrepancy between the most amazing work we do in the lab versus what we can tell our patients, to me, it was something that was very hard for me to kind of reconcile. And I wanted to kind of really bridge the gap. I thought by being a translational scientist, I could bridge the gap. But what I realized was I actually need to learn how to develop drugs for patients faster, more efficiently, and drugs that really work. So that's what
Right.
prompted me to leave academic medicine, at least for a bit, to move into industry and learn drug development. And I was fortunate to be at Merck during the very early days of Keytruda pembrolizumab development. Pembrolizumab, of course, now is foundational immunotherapy, approved in more than 30 indications, and sort of became this, really flagship drug that can help so many patients. But also still, of course, a lot of patients don't respond from immunotherapy. So then my goal became how to help the patients that do not respond, kind of help them
Yeah.
respond to treatments. So I spent my career then kind of moving from academia to industry, doing drug development. I returned to academia at City of Hope to kind of oversee early research and development because so much amazing discoveries happen in the labs, but often investigators don't have the resources, the knowledge that is required from industry perspective to move things to become actual drugs as quickly as possible. And as
Right.
I mentioned, that's always been my passion, is to translate as therapies as quickly as possible. So I continue to
Yeah.
do that to this day.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know you spoke briefly a little bit just now about clinical trials, and that was one of the hardest conversations to have when, something's no longer working. Can you talk a little bit about the differences with, I know for a clinical trial, you almost have to be almost healthy to be a part of a clinical trial, difference between a clinical trial and your work now with compassionate use.
Yes, so of course, as Dr. Finn also described, clinical trials are really, really excellent, but like also Will said, it is very difficult for most cancer patients to get into the clinical trial. There's many reasons for barriers to clinical trial access. One of the main ones is just simply where the patient is located, right? Most cancer patients are seen in the community setting. 85% of cancer care happens in the community, and often patients just are physically not able to get to a center where there maybe really promising clinical trials. And not everybody can pick up and move across the country because there's really this really amazing trial happening in California or in Texas or in Florida or in New York. So that is one big barrier. The second barrier is that you know it takes a lot of money and a lot of time to develop a drug. And in order to do that, clinical trials have to be extremely rigorous, very well controlled. Again, it is truly a lot like selecting. You have to try to select from the beginning the patient that is most likely to not only benefit from the drug, but also most likely to help the drug get forward, right, and ultimately become accessible to many patients. So in some ways, it is exactly like Will said, getting into like an Ivy League school. It's a bit of luck,
Yeah,
it's also like a lot of hard work. And many cancer patients, unfortunately, their disease is such that something about them, it won't fit the eligibility criteria for the trial.
right.
And then another problem is that often, there's great investigational drugs being developed, but they may be a company that is developing them cannot run that trial in every patient that the drug could potentially work. So maybe we are exploring the drug in lung cancer, but that drug could potentially work for liver cancer patients, but there is no clinical trial for the liver cancer. Right. So then how do you enable a liver cancer patient who could potentially benefit from treatment of a drug that is being explored in other indications to be able to still receive that drug if there is rationale, there is mechanisms that would support why that drug should be explored in that patient. So that is when we really have to think about investigational use and through the expanded access and compassionate use pathway, because these patients could, there is a chance that they could benefit from this treatment, but there is no way for them to access it.
Yeah, 100%. And so now this prompts me to talk. I want you to talk a little bit about Wonderlink. I know that you spend so much time in the space and helping navigate these challenges. What eventually inspired to create Wonderlink?
Yes, so Wonderlink Foundation was started because of over the last 20, 30 years, as I said, the hardest conversation to have with a patient is to tell them that you're sort of at the end of the road and there is nothing else that we can do. And then also being in the drug development space and knowing that there are so many amazing therapies that are being developed, but that they are not readily accessible for patients because maybe there isn't really a clinical trial for them. And to create a platform where it is easy for patients, for physicians, and for drug companies to come together in order to enable patients to first and foremost find out more information about investigational treatments, about potentially accessing a therapy through compassionate use, expanded access, about connecting with physicians who are willing to do compassionate use, and to first and foremost to provide resources for physicians both in the community setting or in the academic setting to how to most efficiently navigate this process for patients.
And so when now let's bring back a little bit of Will's story in there. When you and Will connected, was Wonderlink already created?
Yes. Well, we had founded Wonderlink a few years prior. Even though it's my life's passion project, it was a passion, it was a hobby in a way to kind of start. So, but always the goal of Wonderlink was to help patients connect to potentially life-saving therapies, but not so much to guarantee access to a treatment, but first and foremost to give people the opportunity to learn about what could be possible, what questions, to bring up with their doctor, and then if that there is some appropriate therapy that could be explored, how to enable that treating physician to potentially access that therapy for their patients.
Right. I know that there are many hurdles when it comes to compassionate use and getting the treatment. In your personal opinion, what do you think is the biggest hurdle in accessing the drugs?
Well, the last mile problem is, as you said, is truly to access the drugs. That is the biggest hurdle. And probably the biggest hurdle is also time, right? Because time is cancer patients, the advocates, their family, their physicians, everyone is racing against time. And like in Will's case, it is a very difficult place to start from, compassionate use, to think about that when you're being recommended for hospice. Because when you think about it, if a treatment that is enabled today by precision oncology, by really taking into account the individual, their underlying tumor biology, you would want to kind of know about what is most likely to work for that patient before they are recommended for hospice. Because when they are recommended for hospice, most likely it's not so much, they also have so many other organ dysfunction and so many things going on, and it is really, really challenging. Even if somehow accessing the right drug, it may still be very, very difficult to make a meaningful impact because the cancer is just so advanced. So I would say that the biggest barrier is kind of having access to this information that hey, once it is possible that I will exhaust all standard of care, and then it is possible that I won't qualify for a clinical trial, but maybe along the times when I'm looking for clinical trials and also thinking about what other potential investigational treatments could be possible for me, and could it be possible that an individualized, trial, a single patient study is set up for me so that I could have the best outcomes potentially.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Chiki. So we're going to have you stick around. We're going to bring back all of our panelists because we're going to get ready for our Q&A session with all the panelists. In the meantime, I am going to launch a quiz just to see where we're at today with the topic of conversation, if we've learned anything today. Uh, Everyone, please feel free to answer the quiz. Which of the following best describes compassionate use, also known as expanded access? One, standard FDA approved treatment. B, access to an investigational drug outside of a clinical trial for patients with serious or life-threatening illnesses. C, emotional support provided by hospital social workers. Or D, a type of hospice program. Let's see what we learned today while our panelists come back on. Please give us a thumbs up after you guys have answered the question. Awesome. I see 35% of you have answered. And I know our panelists can't answer the questions right now, but I'm sure you guys can see it. So which of the following best describes compassionate use, also known as expanded access? Alrighty. So the correct answer is access to an investigational drug outside of a clinical trial for patients with serious or life-threatening illnesses. Awesome. Thank you guys for participating. All right, so let's get started with our Q&A section. So this one is, I believe, up for Dr. Chiki or Dr. Finn. What do you know about alternative treatments like ivermectin, mistletoe, IV vitamin C, moringa, apricot, bittersweet seeds, and adding natural killer cells either simultaneously or instead of an FDA approved care? That's a long question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, there's two different aspects. One is off-label use of drugs. You know, ivermectin is used to treat infections. Really has no proven anti-cancer activity. And when I say proven, that means in people. Ivermectin has been in the news certainly during COVID. It took on a life of its own, but it's not something that I would advocate to use in treating cancer. The other part of that question are supplements, right? A lot of those things you mentioned, high dose vitamin C, and the other things mentioned, again, do not have high level of evidence that they change outcomes for patients. You know, if someone has not other options, right, and they want to try something, I don't think these things would hurt. Uh, I would be cautious with IV vitamin C. That I think does have potential for organ dysfunction. But a lot of these supplements, when you hear about them, people often mean well. They want to help you and be supportive, but again, there's not a lot of evidence that they really change somebody's outcome. Patients can find stuff on the internet of someone saying, "Oh, I took this and my cancer disappeared." But those are probably not held up to very high scrutiny, right? The internet is a dangerous place because it's the Wild West. People can say whatever they want, and sometimes this gives patients, I think, false hope.
Yeah. I'll let Andrew go. Yeah, I know you have your hand up, and then we'll go to Dr. Shiki.
Yeah, I was just going to say from a caregiver, non-doctor perspective, we looked at all of those things, and And what we did was we spoke to Adrian's physicians if we wanted to add any supplements. We spoke to them first because we didn't want to hurt her liver anymore, and we certainly didn't want to hurt what we thought were possible curative treatments. And so we just had conversations with them about it. But I agree with Dr. Fenn. It is the Wild West, and please don't believe everything you read on social media.
Yes. I would completely agree with that, and I would also recommend that when patients, are getting second opinions, to maybe also explore like the integrative center at the academic hospital, because usually there is great information about that is a place where one can ask about different supplements or something, and of course nutrition plays a key part in achieving potentially best outcomes. And more as we're moving towards, that food is medicine concept as well. But all of these should be explored, within the evidence that is out there, and also within your treating physician, the oncologist that has your best interests in mind, and also for patients to keep in mind that potentially doing some of these other treatments will disqualify you from potentially being able to access a treatment that could help, save your life or prolong your life.
All right.
Yeah, and I would also just say, if someone's offering something and it's very expensive, uh, that's often a red flag, that maybe they don't have your best interest at heart.
All right. Would you like to take a stab at the question from a patient perspective?
Sorry, I missed what the so I missed specific what
Alternative. We'll come back to the more patient-oriented question. I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on it. Um, we'll go ahead and move on to the second question from L-Man. What are the clinical trials being done for HCC? Are there any immunotherapy treatments or just chemotherapy? And the second part of the question, what about immunotherapy approach in clinical trials not toxic for HCC after Y90?
So, chemotherapy, you kind of answered your own question, because we don't really use chemotherapy right now for liver cancer. Chemotherapy was looked at a very long time ago, and, Andrea and her sister were dealing with those choices because that's all there was available, and never really proven to change outcomes. Uh, in 2008, the first drug was approved, sorafenib, which did improve survival versus best supportive care, but left us wanting for more. It was not the most active drug, but it was a big step forward because it showed you could get a drug approved in liver cancer, a disease that pharmaceutical companies often ignored because it was so difficult. Uh, and then after that, we had about 10 years of no drugs, and then we really had an explosion of new molecules, oral drugs by and large, that worked on certain proteins in cancer cells, not chemotherapy, which is really toxic. It's a poisons normal cells and tumor cells, and that's why you see as many side effects. That's not to say that these targeted drugs don't have side effects either. It's a little different in what we're dealing with. The big revolution really came in liver cancer after it had already occurred in other tumor types, and that's the introduction of immunotherapies, really IV, intravenous drugs, antibodies to be specific, that are very specific towards proteins that help regulate the immune system, proteins that help cancer evade the immune system. And these drugs reverse that ability for cancer to escape. And these have really revolutionized every area of oncology, but specifically in liver cancer, have really changed outcomes significantly. We see patients that have significant responses, very deep and meaningful responses. And there's still new immunotherapies being looked at. We had a very big dramatic change in liver cancer in the past, 5, 6 years. And now I think we're stepping back a little bit to better understand uh, other targets to pursue. The other thing that is being pursued are vaccines, and Dr. Chiki is very involved with that. I don't know if she wants to comment on some of the vaccine approaches that are being developed in liver cancer.
Yes, there are great advances being made every day, and absolutely, cancer personalized immunotherapies for cancers, like cancer vaccines, could offer great potential because these new modalities will target most of the tumor neoantigens that the patient has, and therefore we can ensure that we can get the best immune activation against the patient's tumor. This would not necessarily be as monotherapy, but it would be in combination with other immunotherapies that already provide great immune activation. So you could use things like like pembrolizumab, or in combination with first-line immunotherapy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shiki and Dr. Finn. Now, there's another question here. Do you recommend any immunotherapy for an 87-year-old who's a bit frail, stage 3 liver cancer patient?
Obviously we can't give specific recommendations, but I'll
Right.
tell you the current immunotherapy regimens that we have are generally very well tolerated. And it depends why someone's frail. I mean, if you're frail because your tumor is causing that frailty, if you have a response, often we see patients get better. I mean, I've seen dramatic responses. I mean, I've been in the liver cancer space since like 2002, and to see how things have changed, it's remarkable, right? I mean, we have patients who have large tumor burdens, who are frail, and, start on immunotherapy and they do very well. It's a totally different world for us, and it's very motivating. And if a patient's able to come to the office, and otherwise their physiology, their labs and things are okay, I offer patients treatment with immunotherapy. And immunotherapy comes in different flavors, and fortunately we have several options to kind of pick the one where the risk benefit is favorable for any one person's condition.
Right. And Dr. Finn, we have another question that's very specific to you. How helpful slash accurate is the let me see, the DNA molecular testing after initial resection of HCC? What about
Yeah.
hysteropacy or small tumors?
Yeah, so there's a few things there, and I didn't even, someone asked before about immunotherapy and Y90, right?
Right.
Y90 is a local treatment. We've had some a local treatment where radiation's injected into a tumor in the liver. Before that, we were doing a procedure called chemoembolization, and still globally, chemoembolization is done a lot, and even still in the United States to some extent. And there's been several studies that have shown immunotherapy in combination with chemoembolization has improved outcomes. We don't have that high level evidence with Y90 yet, but data is being looked at. The question that just asked, one part is about histotripsy. Histotripsy is kind of the new kid on the block as far as a technology, a device. For a long time, and still, I think the standard in the United States and globally for smaller tumors is to ablate them, right? Unlike Y90 or chemoembolization, where radiology doctors, interventional radiologists, go in the blood vessels into the tumor, typically accessing the blood vessels from a large artery in the leg or the wrist and going into the tumor exactly. Ablation goes through the skin, almost like a biopsy in some way. Radiologist guides a needle, a special probe into the tumor, and that tumor typically gets hot, microwaves, and cooks the tumor. Histotripsy is relatively new, and as a devices get approved based on safety, right? They don't get approved like drugs, where we take one treatment, compare it to another, and show that one is better than the other. Devices have a different pathway to regulatory approval, and histotripsy was approved based on a pretty limited, data set, and they looked at just different types of tumors, not even just liver cancer, and they showed that it destroys tissue, right? And it's non-invasive in that it's a device that goes outside the liver and generates very high frequency energy and aims to destroy the tumor that way. Uh, it's out there in social media more than it is in the medical literature. And that has made some of us a little skeptical, and are waiting to see a little more evidence on that. And your first question, the first comment, you'll have to remind me of that question, Nora. You're muted.
I'd have to go back.
I
I don't believe that it's
Oh, it's
yeah,
ctDNA, right?
Yes.
ctDNA,
Yes.
yep.
Yeah, so I remember seeing that through the chat. So ctDNA stands for circulating tumor DNA. And it's very interesting. This technology actually came out of obstetrics, right? Many women used to get an amniocentesis to sample the baby's DNA, to look for genetic problems. And then it was discovered that you can actually measure the baby's DNA in the mom's blood. So amniocentesis is no longer done because you can get the baby's DNA from the blood. And then that technology was extrapolated to cancer DNA. And it's been shown that cancers leak their DNA into the blood, and you can detect that. So ctDNA is used for looking for mutations in a tumor without doing a biopsy, also called a liquid biopsy, right? You don't need to go into the tumor. In reality, in liver cancer, mutation landscape has not affected our treatment decisions so much. The other way ctDNA is being used, and in this context, something called minimal residual disease, it's a way to use ctDNA as a tumor marker to watch the trends in the amount of ctDNA over time. Some patients whose tumors are growing, even before we can see it on a scan, we can see the ctDNA level go up. And in some patients who are getting treated, you can see ctDNA go down. In fact, just today or yesterday was one of the first FDA approvals of a drug based on ctDNA in bladder cancer. Patients who have bladder cancer resected with cure, if they detect minimal residual disease or their ctDNA, a signature in the blood, and you start immunotherapy just based on that, you improve outcomes rather than waiting for it to appear on a scan, so to speak. So in liver cancer, we don't have that level of evidence yet, but we're working on it. It's an area of active pursuit.
It's a work in progress. Thanks, Dr. Finn. So now a question for Dr. Chiki. Good afternoon. I'm a second year undergrad, Georgia student. I did a project on barriers to health screening with a focus on HCC for my class. Can you speak to socioeconomic barriers to HCC care, lack of general knowledge about the disease among individuals? Also, are there tips you would like to give me for my journey, especially since I'm considering oncology and starting research soon? Thanks.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I mean, of course, I speak with a lot of medical students and and even undergrads, and I would say oncology is the most amazing field. And truly, there is no better time to enter than today. I mean, with the number of advances that are happening every day, the number of tools and technologies that we are getting access to, especially leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning to really understand a patient's disease better, it is an incredible time to be thinking about that. And of course, we need as many caring physicians as possible to be able to serve our patients the best way. I think in terms of the biggest problem and what I have focused some of the work at City of Hope is really the socioeconomic factors, and why we advanced in California the Cancer Patients Bill of Rights is because research has shown that cancer outcomes are widely affected by your zip code as to where you live, and we have talked about that many patients do not have access to clinical trials or to better treatment centers depending on their geographical location. But even other things that, affect your risks. Many patients do not know about risk factors. They do not have appropriate health screenings, or they may not know about, family history, potential things that could increase your risk for a disease. One of the things that within the foundation we're looking at is not only just trying to educate advanced cancer patients, but even championing access to information about screening and prevention, and how can we get ahead of the disease. And so, my recommendation would be to learn, to definitely, get invested in this space, because there is so much opportunity from the early education, prevention, all the way to being able to offer better treatments to patients.
Thank you, Dr. Chiki. Any one of our panelists that would like to add anything on? If not, I'll move on to the next question. Awesome. So we have our next question. In my genetics class, one topic that stuck out to me was the fact that liver cells have pyelopathy. What sort of roles would pyelopathy play in HCC and other liver diseases, like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or liver function?
Yeah, so the question about polyploidy, I like the way you pronounced it, though.
Well, I tried. I'm not,
It had a nice ring to it. I like that.
I'm gonna try
polyploidy
in the
is,
replay.
it's no worries. Polyploidy is not a normal state in human cells. It means you have extra copies of chromosomes. We are all hopefully diploid. You have a set from your mom and dad. And polyploidy, can occur in abnormal conditions, right? So it's not a normal state within the liver, but polyploidy is a common finding in cancer cells for sure.
Anyone else? Awesome. So I think that was our last question for the webinar.
Could I ask?
Yeah, yeah, of
I'm
course.
very curious. Will or Dr. Chiki, what did you get that had you running triathlons?
So Will had a combination treatment. It was a triplet immunotherapy along with local procedures like TACE.
When you say triplet, I mean like PD-1, CTLA-4, or
Yes. So basically exactly an anti-PD-1 with CTLA-4 and another targeted immunotherapy that his tumor expressed markers for.
wow,
Awesome.
great story.
Basically an innate immune activator as well. So
You guys have to connect.
it was a true combination of many treatments, which I think is often the key, with compassionate use, is that when you're designing an individualized patient trial, you have the opportunity to really develop a rational combination, that could make sense for the patient, as long as, of course, it is safe.
I
Thanks,
think
Great.
Doctor. Thanks, Dr. Finn. We were all wondering the same question. Thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and launch our last poll of the day before we say our goodbyes. Um, so after this webinar, what is one step you feel encouraged to take next? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to know where your head's at after this webinar. You can go ahead and answer. Thank you guys for answering. Once you've answered, you can go ahead and give us a thumbs up. I'll leave it up for like 10 more seconds. Awesome. Thank you. I see a couple of thumbs up. All righty. So thank you so much again for joining. I want to get a chance to also thank our sponsors, although they don't have a say in our topics per se, they do make this wonderful work happen. So thank you to Azai and Merck for being our 2026 sponsors. I encourage you all to please join our liver cancer community. It is a HIPAA compliant community. If you would like to, share your experience or simply need someone to talk to you, I encourage you to join as well. And if you would like to donate to our programs to keep this going and to be able to do more of these Truth About Liver Cancers, then we encourage you to donate as well. And thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Will, Dr. Finn, Dr. Chiki, Andrea, in no particular order. It's just how I see you in the screen. Thank you so much for joining us today on Saturday, and we're very thankful for you. And just many, many thanks.
Thank you so much. And I just want to mention what Amy said. Aura, would you mind in the chat before we all say
Yeah,
goodbye?
of
I
course.
love it.
So before we say goodbye, Amy says, thank you for this free webinar. It's very informative. I wish my mom's liver cancer was caught earlier to be qualified for immunotherapy.
Mm.
Thanks, everyone. And you guys are
Thank
really
you.
making a difference. Have a great Saturday. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.